is a battle-hardened enterprise-grade workflow capability along with quite a number of other application development capabilities. They exist on their own infrastructure and provide an enterprise-wide capability for workflow, as well as data management, forms building, and a number of other areas. We'll touch just briefly on those in a moment. Over to the forms side of the story. So once again, a continuum. We start with what we can do natively with SharePoint or bringing in some of the Office, MS Office tools. We then move through to Nintex Forms, which is a relative newcomer into the marketplace, but coming along quickly. We also have options for custom development in .NET, and of course K2 itself also offers a forms capability that's quite robust and integrates very well with the SharePoint experience. Just touching on the left end of this spectrum, so within SharePoint, as some of you may know, we have the concept of lists and libraries, and those are the core objects that we manage information with in SharePoint. Well, by virtue of creating a list or a library, we are in fact automatically creating a number of forms. Forms to display that information, forms to edit that information. Those forms are effectively .NET forms under the hood, and they can be customized. So even out of the box, there are many form capture scenarios that Nintex itself, just by virtue of creating a list, can solve for you. Now beyond that, we get into form requirements that are a bit more complex. When we start to talk about the ability to connect to additional data sources or to write to those data sources, whether we're populating drop-down boxes or firing information into a system, whether we have branching logic or dynamic behaviors that are required on the form, collapsing sections, for example. We have traditionally gone to the InfoPath product, which is part of the MS Office suite and integrates very well within SharePoint. Now, very recently, within a number of months ago, Microsoft announced that it will begin the slow process of deprecating the InfoPath product. So the question on everybody's mind has been, what will the replacement be? Now, the fact of the matter is InfoPath support will continue on past the year 2020. So there are quite a number of viable years left for the InfoPath offering to build solutions. The default response from Microsoft at this point is that InfoPath is still valid. Native SharePoint forms are still valid. We also have form building capabilities in Excel and the ability to bring those into SharePoint via Excel services. There, of course, are our traditional, our old friend, Microsoft Access, gives us a range of form building capabilities, and there is quite a degree of integration possible within SharePoint. And there is still viability in some scenarios in looking at Microsoft Word. Microsoft Word still has the ability to interact with the metadata fields that we have in SharePoint lists, and in some circumstances can still be a viable form solution, though we won't spend any time talking about that today. Moving to the right of that spectrum, Microsoft.NET. So everybody knows what .NET is at this point, unless you've been living under a rock. Effectively, when we start to customize native SharePoint forms, or we start to build our own ASP.NET forms within SharePoint as an application development platform, we're creating custom solutions. We're making a choice that we are going to have a great deal of flexibility. However, we're also going to take on the overheads that we are managing a code base and a reasonably technical solution. On the far end of the spectrum, K2's Forms offering, once again, is hosted out of its core server, integrates very well with the SharePoint experience, provides HTML5 and CSS3 compliant, standards compliant forms, and that's an emerging story as well. The forms story in general is a moving landscape at the moment, and for anybody who has business requirements merging immediately, it's a space that you're going to want to pay attention to because it is not cleanly dominated by any one player. No one has nailed the entire story, and it's a very exciting space to be paying attention to. Just a quick word on the K2 product set. As we mentioned before, this webinar won't focus specifically on K2, but it's a very good product to be aware of when you have requirements that are going to transcend SharePoint in particular. K2 broadly gives you a workflow engine, a data management and smart objects capability. It gives you a form, a building, rendering, and distribution capability, and it gives you a reporting capability and dashboarding capability that lives outside of your core line of business systems. It is considered around these traps to be the battleship of enterprise application development platforms, particularly those that are looking to move more and more of the application development out of code development and into administrable or visual experiences in terms of the design surface. If your requirements are substantial, it is worth taking a look at K2. Let's move immediately into some particular screenshots. Given my webinar window here, I do not see any questions emerging just yet, so we will go ahead and just continue demonstrating some of the capabilities. So today's demonstration is particularly going to focus on the Nintex product sets, and we've got technology willing. We've got some environments set up to have a look at today. Let me just pull a screen swap. Okay. At this stage, the webinar is telling me that you can now see a SharePoint screen with an expenses list on it. So I'll proceed based on that assumption. So the first demonstration we're going to talk about today is going to be the Nintex workflow and the Nintex Forms product set combined. For this demonstration, we have a very, very rudimentary example set up. So the scenario is that we are filing expense claims for our organization. We are passing those expense claims into a single approval process, and that's the end of that particular scenario. However, in the context of this scenario, we're going to look at the SharePoint behavior. We're going to look at the capabilities we have around the workflow, as well as the Forms Designer, and more importantly, and to the point of today's particular webinar, we're going to look at the mobile capabilities that come out of the box with the Nintex capability. So, as you can see on your screen here, I have a simple SharePoint list that has been established for the purposes of capturing expense claims. I also have, by virtue of some very nifty software, my iPhone attached and visible on screen. I'm hoping that's coming through. Yes, it is. So for this particular example, we're going to actually start at the end and work our way back. As you can see on the iPhone screen, there's an application called Nintex Mobile. This is a free downloadable app once you are licensed for the Nintex Forms product, and provides the ability for SharePoint to propagate selected forms, rights-sensitive forms, to particular users to the mobile device. Works on iPhone, Windows, and Android, the variations for each, and gives us the ability to leverage the native device capabilities as well as offline storage and sync to populate those forms. Now, just to conduct the exercise, I'm going to go into the expenses form, which we can see listed here. And by virtue of our technology, we have certain fields populated. So the date's populated for us. We have a drop-down list for categorization on this particular form that is actually drawn from a SharePoint list. That data is passed through to the form. I'm going to cite an example here where I've had a $400 lunch, just because I can. I'm going to select a month for the attribution of this expense. I'm also going to leverage some native device capability, and I'm going to indicate where I am by choosing the location button. We'll populate the GPS coordinates into the form, and I'm going to utilize my iPhone's camera capability to add an attachment. In this case, we will photograph something and call it a receipt. How about the webinar microphone? That'll do just fine. So we'll take a picture of that. We will attach that. And we will now submit this form for consideration. As you can see, the forms going to the outbox. This is a cached capability, so if you do not have network connectivity, Nintex Mobile is going to keep that data safe until such time as it has the connectivity, and then it's going to send that data off to our SharePoint site. Now, switching back to our SharePoint list, which just for those who are curious is merely a demo box that we have set up on a virtual private server somewhere. I'm going to go ahead and refresh that list. And we will find that that expense has now been passed through to our SharePoint list as my $400 lunch. The status indicates in progress. By virtue of the GPS coordinates, I also have an integrated Bing map capability that indicates where I was at the time, and yes, that's where the OBS office is in Brisbane. Furthermore, before we actually process this, we have the ability to look at the workflow history directly. And this will be your first sneak peek into the visual design surface that the Nintex workflow product brings us. So here we have the diagrammatic representation of this workflow and a color-coded indication of where the status is. So we can see, although these are not named in a friendly way for this particular example, that the workflow is green down to the process of assigning an approval task to a party. Just going to open my chat window for a moment because I see it flashing at me. Yes, to that question, the presentation slides, as well as the rest of the material we've got for you, will be sent out, so there's no reason to be scratching notes at the moment. There's another question regarding K2. We are working on improving our relationship with K2, and I anticipate being able to run some demonstrations and webinars regarding the K2 product very shortly. We'll keep you posted on that. So let's go back to our expense claim. Furthermore, for this example, I've set myself up as my own approver so that I can demonstrate to you the email capabilities. So as an approver of this expense claim, I've been sent an email notification by virtue of Nintex workflow. This is a customizable template, so you can brand or better format these particular notifications. And in this particular case, it's providing me a link back to the task for me to approve this particular expense claim. I'll go ahead and I'll click that to get back to the desktop experience. And I can see that I've got a very simple form here to approve, reject. I can also, at this time, by virtue of the Nintex product, I can delegate this task to someone else. In this particular case, because I like approving my own $400 lunches, I'm going to go ahead and just give myself an approval. Pardon me, having some technical difficulties here. You can see that part of the form is giving me some additional information. All of the metadata is available within the system to surface in just about any way you would like. Great. So if we go back to our expenses list, we will now see that that status has changed to completed. Now, what we can do with Nintex workflow is limited only by your imagination. If there are 15 people that we need to notify of this expense claim, no problem. We can fire those emails. If we need to call a web service to fire the details of this expense claim into a receiving web service or a line of business system, such as a finance system, to effect payment, that's something that can be coded out very easily within the Nintex workflow set. If we had delegations of authority to look up regarding the size of the expense or the type of expense, these are customizations that can also be made without affecting the core product. So workflow can be quite complex, or as simple as you want it to be. Now, another thing we want to demonstrate about this particular example, and I'll just shut that down. I want to take a look at the actual workflow designer. So on the workflow side of things, As you can see, the design surface for Nintex is embedded within the SharePoint experience. It uses the common ribbon interface at the top, and we can see that we have quite a number of actions that are made available to us to interact with web services, to interact with Active Directory if we're on the enterprise version. We can interact with Dynamic CRM. We can call Excel services if it's running in our SharePoint environment. We can fire any old web requests to common web services. We can interact with SharePoint libraries and lists, move items, check items in and out. We can copy items. We can route items. We can delete items, so that we have a complete content control within the SharePoint context. For those who are more technical, we have quite a few logical controls within the workflow engine. So we can create groups of actions that must complete as a whole before the workflow proceeds. We can define stages and states. We can filter data. We can run loops. We can run state machines that allow us to do very complex stateful behaviors and other types of switching. We also have interaction with Nintex Live. If we think of an app store model, there are a growing number of predefined workflows out there, both free and for a small stipend, that allow us to conduct social integrations, such as Twitter, Yammer. There's also some Facebook gear out there, I've noticed. We can interact with Office 365 and create hybrid scenarios where we're moving content back and forth, and the list goes on. We have mathematical operations, other calculatory operations. Very importantly, from a SharePoint standpoint, we can also do things on the enterprise version like create Active Directory accounts for users. So this is particularly useful if we're building staff onboarding workflows and we want to start to automate the provision of logins and accounts, credentials for the users, establishment of their details within profile services, decommissioning on the back end of that process. And we also have extensive ability to create structures within SharePoint. To cite an example, a personal example actually, the very first time that I used Nintex as a version 2007, within a 3-day period of first touching the product, I was able to create a project register at an upper level site within a SharePoint 2007 setting that had subsites based on a template automatically created every time I instantiated a new entry in my project register. So I was managing a series of IT projects based on a templated project site that contained task lists, risk registers, and document control the way I like to use them. In that particular case, it was a Prince2 model that was applied. And all of the provisioning of that SharePoint content and those structures were completely automated by Nintex workflow. Furthermore, there was an additional workflow that ran every morning to gather information from those project sites back up into my daily project status report. So I had stoplight charting in Excel that was being fed by the data in those lower level sites. That's one example of what you can do with the workflow engine. Very, very powerful. So of course we have other SharePoint items. We can assign tasks, move tasks around, set reminders, send notifications, and so forth. All of the actions are literally drag and drop behaviors onto the design surface, and all of the actions are configurable with property screens. Now, whilst it is possible to get into a degree of technology regarding these, you can code within Nintex. You can set up web service calls. You can interact with SQL Server databases and be writing code within these. It is also possible for business users without that technical capability to build simple approval and routing workflows or notifications. As you can see, these are no more complex than your common internet banking, or if you've booked your holiday online, you've probably used something more complex than this. Additionally, workflows, like all SharePoint objects, are version controlled. So it is possible to have multiple versions of a workflow as the workflow evolves and changes. And if there are instances of a particular workflow running at that particular time, they will stay running at that version level until such time as they're finished. The administrative interface within SharePoint exists purely from the ribbon. We are able to manage workflows in the traditional way using SharePoint Designer, or we can manage those workflows right off the context menu, assuming we have the right authority to do so within SharePoint. We have the ability to import and export. This is important when we're establishing templating. So commonly used snippets of workflow or commonly used workflows can be built into a library that's managed by your business process department or staffing. And these begin to build an economy of scale as we start to build out business process automation solutions. And of course, we have the ability to publish these items as well as keep them in a draft form whilst we do developmental work on them. If we switch over to the form side for a moment, and we'll use the expense claim example, we can see with Nintex Forms that again we have a design surface that's embedded within our SharePoint experience, gives us a drag and drop capability to administer the native forms that are tied to these lists and libraries that we're working with. In the case of Nintex Forms, the options that we have available to us become a bit more extensive because we're dealing with design capabilities. But once again, we have all the usual culprits in terms of the types of fields that we can drag and drop. This is a growing list, particularly around native device capabilities such as signature panel. We've already got geolocation, image capabilities, and so forth. The roadmap for the Nintex Forms offering is now going to move into better access to systemic data or line of business systems data, and is going to be a growing roadmap of capability that allows us to solve different business problems. We also have the ability right out of the box to interact with SharePoint list data. So if we need to populate those drop-down boxes, or if we need to write information back to the SharePoint list in a particular way, we have a degree of control over that. And we have, as we said, a growing number of list capabilities. For Nintex Forms, we go one step further as well. Right out of the box, we've got the ability to start tailoring forms for particular devices where it's appropriate. Now, a lot of people talk about mobility from a responsive standpoint. SharePoint by itself is not necessarily out of the box the most responsive technology in the world because of the way that SharePoint is constructed. It's not going to flex perfectly on every particular device. So therefore, some rectification work typically has to be done whether we're just talking about pages and lists or whether we're talking about forms to get that looking right on our mobile devices and our iPads and so forth. With Nintex Forms, they're dealing with this by creating renditions. And so dynamically, particularly when we're deploying to the Nintex mobile capability, we are actually designing renditions of the form specifically for that device. So we are able in fleet scenarios or field scenarios, particularly if we have a controlled fleet of devices, if we talk about resources scenarios or scientific or even marketing scenarios where we're out on the street collecting data from end users or citizens, we have the ability to tailor that particular experience right down to a given mobile device. And like workflow or other SharePoint objects, we have the ability to maintain version history over these forms. We can see that this particular demo form has been through a lot of versioning. And we have the ability to recall and republish those old versions, go back to them, reference them, and what have you. Just taking a pause to check the questions panel. There's a question, is it possible to have SharePoint lookup column that accesses organization names from Skill CRM that could be accessed via the Nintex app? The short answer is yes. Whilst the native data connection capability in Nintex Forms is limited at the moment to SharePoint lists, That being said, there's a number of ways to skin the problem of connections to line of business systems. First of all, we have in SharePoint the concept of BCS. BCS is a data connectivity service that exists within SharePoint and allows us to bring line of business data into SharePoint lists as if it is a SharePoint list. That's one form of integration. Also within Nintex Forms, we are able to apply client-side code. So recently, where we've had very complex form scenarios, so dynamic behaviors, lots of data connectivity in the Nintex form, we're able to leverage jQuery or JavaScript within the form design itself to accomplish 99% of these scenarios. It's really quite flexible when you start to apply that, and given that it's Java-based, you have a wide degree of supportability across all devices. Like Nintex Workflow, we also have that import-export capability, which gives us a templating capability. One of the first things that OBS will do when we are approaching an enterprise form solution with Nintex is that we will look at your branding and we will actually design common layouts that can be reused, once again, gaining that economy of scale in terms of the development. Now, just quickly on value propositions. So there is a price point to the Nintex products for the value they bring. Generally speaking, if we look just at the workflow side of things, most of our consultants would agree that given that it is not an outrageous price point for Nintex workflow, and given the power that the enterprise version brings your IT crew, your marketing crew, or any other business users in terms of driving document management solutions, digitizing corporate services type forms, particularly if they're currently paper-based or running in duplicate and triplicate data entry and creating consistency problems, the value proposition very quickly pays for itself, generally within 3 to 5 solutions. If you've got, for example, let's say 3 to 5 business scenarios that are akin to an expense claim, a leave request, a corporate card acquittal, or some of these other scenarios that we see in corporate services, generally 3 to 5 of those, if we were to develop those in native workflow, or if we were to look at the keystrokes, the time, the FTEs, and the responsiveness that we've lost by keeping those paper-based, the business case begins to justify itself by an order of magnitude very quickly. For the organizations that we deal with commonly that are looking to take a suite of automation problems, generally between 5 and anywhere up to 20 or 30 different automation scenarios, particularly those that have a field requirement, so mobile devices, offline caching, geolocation. The cost of the Nintex products quickly becomes irrelevant because they are a very affordable set of technologies. The same is true for forms. However, as we said at the beginning of the presentation, for forms we really need to look at what our business scenario is. Form scenarios come in many, many shapes and sizes, from simple data capture to complex surveys or multi-part processes. And as we look at our own organizations, I'm sure we can all agree that there are a wide array of simple to complex business processes that might require that kind of automation. They may or may not involve external data connectivity. They may involve or not involve writing data to external systems. They may, in some cases, some of the more extreme cases we've seen, involve surfacing report data or tabular data within the form as part of the business process. So bringing line of business system data or actuarial data into a form so that the person filling out the form has the ability to reference information before they lodge a new transaction or lodge a new form. All of these scenarios are possible in most of the technologies. But what we'll find as we go through the forms capabilities is that some products are better than others. I might just actually switch quickly back to the continuum slide that we were discussing. Pardon my keystrokes here. It was this slide here. I'd like to give just a few specifics about each of these options for forms. So as we said, out of the box, SharePoint lists and libraries give you an ASP.NET form that is not very responsive, can be made more responsive, but it effectively requires that connection directly to your SharePoint instance. Within SharePoint, we can have InfoPath. Now, InfoPath is still a powerful contender, although some would argue that it can be a little bit cumbersome to work with at times for some of the more complex scenarios. InfoPath has proven itself in the area of data connectivity. It has proven itself in terms of being able to build complex and very large-scale forms that have multiple parts or are paginated or turned into wizard-type experiences. It is also a technology that does, with a little trickery, allow us to bring in reporting information and surface that, in some cases, even as what's called an SSRS report. And it is in widespread use. It is also a very scalable solution. InfoPath integrates well with SharePoint either as a storage mechanism, but you can also be running, if you have the correct enterprise CALs, you can be running InfoPath services, and you can surface those forms right within the SharePoint experience. And many organizations have had some experience with InfoPath. We would argue that for your more complex form scenarios, that InfoPath is going to be a viable solution, should still be considered on the table, probably for the next couple of years. You've probably got a few years where you can still get a 2 to 5 year lifespan out of a business solution by building in an InfoPath. We've seen some of the things that the Nintex solution could do for the price point. It is certainly going to lower your development times because it is a visual interface, because it is a property screen-based configuration, and because it integrates so well with the SharePoint environment, and forms and workflow, of course, work very well together. They're designed to work together. The added value of having the native mobile client for Nintex Forms is certainly a deal sweetener when it comes to Nintex, given that you don't have any other cost consideration when deploying the mobile client other than the normal IT issues of looking after your fleet of mobile devices and your security paradigm. Custom solutions, look, we all want to stay away from custom solutions, don't we? Config over customization is always preferable. However, we do live in a world where some business scenarios will demand that customization. The .NET capabilities have grown and grown and grown to the point where they are a sophisticated, enterprise-grade, scalable coding option for when we really have very special things that we need to create, or when the degree of system integration, data management, or dynamic behaviors that we need to generate on the form are really moving beyond what we can do with a simple drag-and-drop editor. I'm just going to move back to the chat window for a moment and address a few more questions. Just noting the time, we're down to about 10 minutes. Scanning through. We have one question. Hi, if we wanted to have mobile forms to collect shareholder insights in the field at events and communication opportunities, would we need Nintex Forms to do this? Or is there a native SharePoint plug that would enable deployment of mobile forms for collecting stakeholder insights? And that's from somebody named Julie. Thank you, Julie, for the question. The short answer is that you do not require Nintex Forms for that process. However, you would be relegated to looking at what you can do to make the native forms in SharePoint more responsive, depending on what your devices in the field were going to be. Now, at the end of the day, the output of an ASP page or a .NET page is effectively HTML and some CSS. Notwithstanding that, you have the ability to manipulate those layouts and that particular output to a high degree. We, for example, in intranet and internet settings, have basically been able to make SharePoint look nothing like SharePoint and to get those forms onto mobile screens. I could cite one local example. There is a local council down south of Brisbane who we developed a proof of concept for. It was designed as a SharePoint site collection that was exposed securely through their DMZ to the internet. Counselors who are out in the field talking to citizenry have a portal that, with a little bit of tweaking to the page layouts, was fully renderable on an iPad. So they were all armed with iPads out in the street, walking up to citizens' doors with access through that portal on that mobile device to calendaring information and the event management system that drove their calendaring within the internal organization. There was a feed through to their internal eDocs document management system to be able to pull up reference information. There was a section of the portal that allowed them to interact with board and committee papers in a secure fashion. And importantly, there were some web parts and plugins that brought or surfaced information from their request management system called Pathways. So that particular system is a line of business system that collects form-based data from citizenry off their website into a central administration system for actioning. So this is everything from complaints about the noise through to there's a park bench with graffiti on it, so forth and so on. Any inquiry coming from the citizenry within the council area. So the counselors through this portal had secure access to all of that information via the iPad. Now that was not done with Nintex Forms. That was done all with native capability. Now to be fair, it ran beautifully. It looked wonderful on the iPad and was very responsive. There was some coding involved in that. There was some customization to the page layouts and to the CSS, and there were lots of rounds of testing to make sure that that look and feel and that experience on the mobile device were exactly the way we wanted that to be. So it is possible to do these things without the product set. This comes back to a few key questions, particularly in the Nintex context. For the price point that one faces, looking at each of those products individually or as a bundle, there's a substantial discount applied if you bundle them. What are the number of form and workflow solutions that we want to solve? If it's one, and only one, and will only ever be one, it might be best to look at some of the native capabilities to do that, or worst case, a small custom solution if it's very complex. Good old InfoPath, even Excel has the ability to collect data for us in a SharePoint context. And some of those experiences can be made quite friendly on a mobile device. There's no problem with that, and they don't have to be bigger than Ben-Hur projects either. They can be reasonably sized depending on what your business requirement is. However, when we start to talk about several form solutions, as well as the department over to the left who also wants to be running policy and procedure stacks within SharePoint and have cyclical review processes and apply some automation to the approval and authoring processes, and then perhaps finance gets involved and wants to get the paper out of an expense claim. Now you've got a very, very easy business case for the cost consideration of the Nintex product set. And when you look at bundling, it makes sense to get both. The other key benefit we think about is who are the administrative users going to be? If we are still in the days of luxury where we have a lot of technocrats on our team, we've got a large IT department, and we can afford that, and they're happy to take on this tool set or this business problem, you don't have to use Nintex. But Nintex gives us the ability through very simple drag and drop design interfaces to allow business users in, or to extend the reach and responsibility levels out to business users. So depending on the scenario and depending on the degree of complexity in the form and the workflow, particularly around data management, we don't necessarily have to get technical skills involved. And that's probably one of the key benefits of the third-party extensions, is that they allow you these design surfaces. To be fair to K2, absolutely the same scenario. You have drag and drop design interfaces that for forms and workflow are actually embedded within the SharePoint experience. Same scenario. What differentiates those two particular products is really about scale and complexity. If I'm going to automate some SharePoint-specific processes, or I'm going to do simple corporate services forms that live within a SharePoint context within my intranet, Nintex is a great entry point. If I'm looking to overhaul and automate my entire business process across the organization, inside and outside of the office, I start to look at the broader picture and look towards the K2s of the world because of the extensive data management capability and other capabilities they bring us. I hope that that has answered that question. In retrospect, we will be going back through these questions and providing written responses as well. I'll move on to the next. As a comment, actually, I have found InfoPath to be very, very cumbersome and creates a massive overhead in ongoing management. Unsupported after 2020, question mark, asking for thoughts. There is some personal bias that I bring to this question, or my response to this question. Having developed quite a few InfoPath solutions in my earlier days and in earlier versions, the 2007 version in particular, for most simple form scenarios, particularly those that were maybe more marketing focused and simple corporate services scenarios, I had no problem with InfoPath. If there was anything cumbersome about those scenarios, it might have been to do with the fact that there are some security configurations when you're deploying InfoPath forms to file shares or to SharePoint, either as a library object or as an InfoPath services form. They can be a little tedious to work through. When we talk about the more complex business problems, absolutely. That is my personal opinion, but I find that if you're doing dozens and dozens and dozens of very complex business forms, let's talk about it. Well, we've had a conversation recently with a number of accountancies who are looking to move past InfoPath because they have very, very large auditing and tax-related forms built in InfoPath. The management and administration overhead of that on an annual basis is becoming very, very large. So yes, it is a default recommendation right out of the box to start looking at design tools that start to reduce that workload, that allow us to make changes and control renditions and versions for devices uniquely, and to do so in a graphical way that people are more comfortable with. The more we can get away from code, the better, generally, unless the business scenario just absolutely demands that kind of customization. So that's my personal opinion. You might get different answers from different consultants. We have some folks who are absolutely in love with InfoPath and will swear by it. And just with regards to the date, yes, I believe 2023 will be the very last point at which Microsoft will honor any support requests at all for the InfoPath product. Could have that date wrong, but that's what I was reminded of yesterday. Another comment. We are downsizing the IT team and have limited SharePoint installed to date. Do OBS or partners offer support services for SharePoint and Nintex platforms? Short answer, absolutely yes. OBS, and I guess I'll pull up our ending slides, given that we are almost out of time. So just quickly about us. OBS is a national Microsoft partner in Australia. We're about 140 consultants strong at the moment. We work primarily at the moment around Dynamics CRM and SharePoint, both online and on-premise versions, as well as a cloud of products and services that support those core platforms. We are very, very strong on the SharePoint side. We also have managed services division and capabilities for application support, hosting, and a range of other services. If you're interested in those things, flick us a note. We'll be happy to send through some information. We also work extensively with other partners when needed to provide a full range of services around these things. I guess one of the key things to note about OBS is, although we are technology specialists, we are also a business consultancy. So we are not interested in just looking at your technical problem. We want to understand your business. We want to understand your business processes. And so we have the business analysis skills, the process mapping skills. We've got the change management skills, the project management skills that wrap around our technical capability to provide a full end-to-end service. I couldn't leave you without at least one plug regarding some of the things that we think are really useful for any SharePoint or any project in general, particularly SharePoint and process automation projects. As general advice, look, engage partners and engage staff internally in a way that focuses on the business outcomes. The technology is a very, very small part of the problem. And the sophistication of the kinds of tools that are cost-effective to bring into your organization now, let alone the cornucopia of capability that SharePoint 2013 brings by itself, is really quite substantial. It allows us to start really focusing on user experiences and the desired business outcomes and the return on investment. I cannot stress that enough. Also, it doesn't matter what project you're doing in information management or software, plan for and embrace change. Take on adaptive or agile methodologies and improve the outcomes and the value that the initial parts of your project generate right off the bat by taking that incremental or iterative approach. Understand that change will happen. If you process map everything up front into documents, by the time you're done, you will have to go back and start repainting the Sydney Harbor Bridge, and you'll never get around to actually building anything fun and useful. As a general guideline, particularly with form and workflow solutions, using incremental methodologies such as Agile, get the solutions in their rudimentary form in front of users as quickly as possible. You need to start collecting real feedback from the field rather than theory from the back office. This will help your projects along. Focus on building internal capability. As we've talked about, the kinds of tools that are available now are getting us further and further away from the technology and into business tools, business management tools that are very easy to use. If you can, as I said, if you can book your holiday online at Where Is, if anybody can do that successfully, I'll pay you $5. This is simpler technology to use than most of those interfaces. So it shouldn't be difficult to allocate individuals who are in or outside the IT team to begin to look after some of this capability. And lastly, keep the communication flowing. I guess that's a bit of a broad statement, but look for vendors such as OBS that know how to keep the communication flow, that know how to iterate through projects, and know how to keep that focus on the business value, that know how to bring your end users along for the journey. When you begin process automation and mobility projects in particular, this is one form of project that is going to bring you to the coalface of people's fear much more quickly than many others. Everybody gets a little nervous when there's new software deployment, but when you're starting to reduce FTEs and keystrokes, people fear for their jobs, they fear for radical change, and they become very concerned about the ambient questions that sit around why we're looking to do things in the field or do things remotely. It raises a lot of other issues. So taking some of these success factors to heart will help you move your process automations and your mobility projects along a bit further. If you approach them as a technology project, I would suggest you're probably dead in the water from the start. That's my personal opinion. We'll follow up with some information on this. There are a number of events coming up that may be useful to you, particularly in the context of forms and automation. So we regularly host the Brisbane SharePoint Users Group, if you happen to be dialing in from Brisbane. That's October 9th. We'll send some information out about that. October 14th, we are actually running a road show nationally that will focus on forms and process automations. This will be a chance to actually get up close and personal with more consultants and deeper demos than we're able to demonstrate today. And we also have on October 28th a Power BI, I've missed a space there, a Power BI demonstration and discussion that is well worth your time. If you don't know what Power BI is from the Microsoft stack, it's something that everyone needs to probably become aware of. Tremendous value there. These things are always so fun given only 60 minutes to play with. If we have not managed to address any of those questions, we'll follow up. We thank you very much for your time and attention today. If you have any specific inquiries, feel free to contact us. That's my email address on screen there. And again, thank you. Have a wonderful, wonderful week, and we hope to hear from you soon.